Hello, my dear friends. As the world moves into the long and uncertain years of the Second World War, millions of soldiers leave their homes and step into lives shaped not only by danger, but by routine. War is often remembered through battles and machines, yet for the men and women who lived inside it, much of each day revolved around something far simpler and far more human: food. What a soldier ate determined how far he could march, how long he could stay awake, and how well his body could endure cold, fear, and exhaustion. Meals became a quiet structure in a life that otherwise felt unstable. For most soldiers, food was not chosen. It was issued. It came in tins, packets, and crates marked with numbers and letters rather than names. Governments had to feed millions of people at once, often in places where farms had been destroyed and roads were broken. This meant meals had to be portable, long-lasting, and simple to prepare. Taste mattered less than calories. A meal was judged not by how good it was, but by how much energy it gave and how easy it was to carry. In the early years of the war, many armies still believed fresh food could be supplied regularly. Soldiers were given bread, meat, potatoes, and soup when possible. Field kitchens followed behind the front lines, cooking large pots of stew or porridge that could be carried forward in metal containers. When the lines were stable, soldiers sometimes ate warm meals twice a day. These meals were simple, but they felt comforting because they reminded them of home. A bowl of soup eaten beside a muddy road could feel like a small piece of normal life. But as fighting spread across continents, fresh food became harder to deliver. Roads were bombed, trains were destroyed, ships were sunk. Armies learned that food had to survive long journeys and rough handling. This led to the rise of preserved meals. Meat was dried or canned. Bread was baked hard so it would not rot. Vegetables were turned into powders or sealed in tins. Sugar and fat became important because they carried energy in small amounts. Each country developed its own way of feeding soldiers. The British relied heavily on canned meat, biscuits, and tea. Tea was not only a drink, but a comfort. It was carried into deserts, forests, and ruined cities. Even when food was scarce, soldiers were given tea because it warmed the body and calmed the mind. Biscuits were thick and dry, designed to last for months without spoiling. They were often so hard that soldiers broke them with rifle butts or soaked them in water or tea before eating. German soldiers were given bread, sausage, cheese, and soup when supply lines were strong. They also carried hard bread called Knäckebrot and tins of meat. In the early years, when Germany controlled large farming areas, food was more plentiful. Later, as supplies weakened, meals became smaller and more repetitive. Hunger became as familiar as fear. American soldiers received carefully designed rations. These were packed in boxes and labeled with letters. Some were meant for short missions, others for longer ones. They included canned meat, crackers, chocolate, coffee, sugar, and powdered drinks. These meals were planned by nutrition experts who tried to give soldiers enough calories to keep marching and fighting. The food was not always liked, but it was dependable. Soldiers knew that even far from home, a box of rations would arrive. In colder regions, food had to do more than fill the stomach. It had to fight cold itself. Fat became very important because it helped the body stay warm. Soldiers in snowy areas ate more bacon, butter, and meat when available. Warm drinks were prized. Soup and coffee could lift spirits as much as they warmed hands. A hot cup held between cold fingers could feel as important as a blanket. In deserts and tropical jungles, food faced different problems. Heat spoiled fresh supplies quickly. Insects found anything sweet or oily. Soldiers learned to eat quickly and store food carefully. Rice, dried meat, and canned goods became common. Water became more valuable than food. Without enough water, even a full meal felt useless. Many soldiers remembered thirst more than hunger. Meals were often eaten wherever a soldier happened to be. On the ground, in trenches, inside broken buildings, in trucks or foxholes. Plates were rare. Food was eaten from tins or directly from hands. Knives became spoons. Helmets sometimes became bowls. There was little ceremony, but there was routine. Breakfast when possible. A main meal when the fighting slowed. Small snacks carried in pockets for long marches. Food was also tied closely to morale. When meals were hot and regular, soldiers felt stronger. When food was late or missing, fear and anger grew. Sharing food became a form of friendship. A piece of chocolate traded for a cigarette. A biscuit given to a tired friend. These small exchanges built bonds between people who depended on one another for survival. Sometimes soldiers found food outside their rations. They bought from villages when allowed. They traded with civilians. They picked fruit from trees. They cooked animals they caught themselves. These moments felt like freedom because they broke the strict pattern of issued meals. A fresh egg or a loaf of bread could feel like a feast. As the night settles over a quiet camp somewhere far from home, imagine a group of soldiers sitting near a small fire. Their boots are muddy. Their coats are heavy. In their hands are tin cups of soup and pieces of hard bread. They eat slowly, not because the food is special, but because the moment is calm. Around them, the world is broken by war. Inside them, this simple meal holds them together. They do not think about vitamins. They do not think about nutrition charts. They only know that eating means another day of strength. And in a war shaped by machines and movement, food becomes one of the few steady things. A small, quiet reminder that even in the middle of history's loudest conflict, life continues through simple human needs. As the war stretches across more lands and seasons, food becomes not only a necessity but a quiet problem that must be solved every single day. Armies move far from their own farms and factories, and the distance between soldiers and kitchens grows longer. What a soldier eats now depends not on where he is from, but on how well supply lines survive bombs, weather, and broken roads. When trains run and ships arrive, meals feel steady. When routes are cut, hunger becomes part of the uniform. For many soldiers, the most common meal is something that does not look like a meal at all. It comes in a tin or a packet, sealed tight and marked with simple words or numbers. Inside might be meat packed in jelly, thick soup, dried vegetables, or hard bread meant to last for months. These foods are chosen not for taste, but for survival. They must not rot. They must not break easily. They must be eaten cold if fire is impossible. This kind of food teaches soldiers to eat without ceremony. There is no table, no plate, and often no time. A meal becomes something opened, shared, and swallowed quickly before moving again. The American Army designs its rations carefully. Some boxes are meant for one day, others for several days. Inside are small cans of meat, crackers that do not crumble, chocolate that resists melting, coffee, sugar, and powdered drinks. Chewing gum is included not for hunger, but to keep the mouth busy and the mind awake. Cigarettes are also packed with food, because commanders believe they calm nerves and help soldiers endure stress. These rations are heavy, but reliable. A soldier can carry his meals on his back and survive without a kitchen for days. British soldiers rely on similar preserved food, but with strong habits tied to home. Tea is always present. Even in the desert or in ruined towns, soldiers boil water for tea when they can. It is not only a drink, it is a pause. It is a way to feel normal again. Biscuits are thick and dry, meant to last without molding. Canned meat, sometimes called bully beef, is eaten again and again until its taste becomes familiar and dull. Jam and margarine appear when supplies are good. When they are not, meals become bread and tea alone. German soldiers begin the war with better access to fresh food because they move through farming lands. They eat bread, sausage, potatoes, and soup when supply lines are strong. Field kitchens cook hot meals that are carried forward in large metal containers. But as the war turns and resources shrink, their food becomes simpler and scarcer. Hard bread, canned meat, and dried soup become common. Hunger grows slowly, not suddenly. Soldiers learn to make one meal last as long as possible. In the Soviet Army, food depends heavily on location and season. When trains bring supplies, soldiers receive bread, porridge, cabbage soup, and sometimes meat. When supplies fail, meals become thin and small. Grain and potatoes form the base of many meals. Warm soup is prized more than solid food because it warms the body and fills the stomach at the same time. Vodka is sometimes issued, not as food, but as a way to give warmth and courage in cold conditions. In places like North Africa and the Pacific Islands, heat changes everything. Food spoils quickly. Meat goes bad in hours. Insects find sugar and fat. Soldiers depend more on canned goods and dried food. Rice becomes important because it can be stored and cooked easily. Fish is eaten when caught. Fruit is taken from trees when possible. Water becomes more valuable than any meal. Without water, even the best food feels useless. Soldiers remember thirst more clearly than hunger in these regions. Cooking is often simple or impossible. Fires reveal positions to enemies. Smoke can be seen from far away. Many soldiers eat cold food straight from tins. When cooking is possible, it is done quietly and quickly. A small fire, hidden behind a wall or hill, heats soup or warms bread. Helmets are sometimes used as cooking pots. Knives become spoons. A shared flame becomes a shared moment of rest. Food also becomes a kind of currency. Soldiers trade chocolate for cigarettes. They swap canned meat for fruit from civilians. A piece of bread can buy a favor. A tin of coffee can build a friendship. These small trades give soldiers a feeling of control in a life where most things are decided for them. When supplies fail completely, soldiers turn to the land around them. They pick vegetables from fields, they catch chickens, they fish in rivers. These meals feel different from ration food. They feel real. A fresh egg or a hot potato can lift spirits more than any medal. For a moment, war feels far away. As night comes to a camp after a long day of marching or fighting, soldiers sit close to one another. They open tins with pocket knives. They pour hot water into cups of powder. They share what they have. The food is plain. The place is dangerous. But the act of eating together brings a small sense of peace. They do not think about the science of calories. They do not think about balance of nutrients. they think about getting through tomorrow. And in a war where everything moves and changes, food remains one of the few steady rhythms of life. A reminder that even in the middle of destruction, the body still needs the same simple things it always has. As the war continues and stretches deeper into Europe, Africa, and Asia, food becomes more closely tied to geography and supply routes. Soldiers fighting near their own countries often eat differently from those stationed far away. In Europe, where farms still operate under difficult conditions, bread and potatoes remain common when transport allows. Field kitchens follow behind the troops, preparing large pots of stew made from whatever ingredients can be found or delivered. These kitchens work constantly, moving forward as armies advance and pulling back when they retreat. When they reach soldiers in time, warm food becomes a powerful support for both body and morale. In many cases, soldiers eat the same meal day after day. Repetition becomes part of military life. Canned meat, hard biscuits, dried vegetables, and powdered soup appear again and again. Over time, soldiers learn how to mix and prepare these foods in different ways. Biscuits are crushed into soup to make it thicker. Meat is fried when fire is available. Sugar is added to drinks or eaten alone for quick energy. Small changes make familiar food feel new, even when ingredients stay the same. In long campaigns, shortages become common. When trucks cannot reach the front, soldiers survive on what they already carry. Portions grow smaller. Meals are skipped. Hunger becomes something that must be managed rather than avoided. Soldiers eat slowly to make food last longer. They save pieces of bread for later. They share with those who have less. In these moments, food becomes more than fuel. It becomes a measure of discipline and cooperation. Captured food supplies also change diets. When armies move into new areas, they sometimes use enemy stores. German soldiers eat French bread and cheese. Allied soldiers eat Italian pasta or German canned goods. Local food enters military life through necessity. This blending of diets shows how war reshapes everyday habits. A soldier's meal no longer reflects his culture alone, but the land he is fighting on. In prisoner of war camps, food is more limited and more controlled. Prisoners receive thin soup, small portions of bread, and sometimes vegetables. Malnutrition becomes common. Weight loss and weakness spread through camps. For many prisoners, food becomes the central concern of each day. They talk about meals they remember from home. They dream about bread, meat, and warm drinks. Hunger shapes thought as much as it shapes the body. In the Pacific War, American and Japanese soldiers face different challenges. Jungle heat spoils food quickly. Insects infest supplies. Rice becomes the base of many meals for Japanese troops. American soldiers depend heavily on canned food and dried rations shipped across the ocean. Fresh food is rare. When coconuts, fruit, or fish are found, they are eaten immediately. These moments provide relief from the constant taste of preserved food. On ships and submarines, food must last for weeks or months without resupply. Meals are carefully planned. Bread is eaten first because it spoils quickly. Later meals rely on canned meat and dried goods. Fresh fruit and vegetables disappear early in the journey. Over time, sailors eat more of the same food until menus become very simple. Space limits cooking, so meals are basic and repeated. As soldiers move between climates, their diets change with the environment. In winter, hot soup and fatty food help fight cold. In summer, lighter meals are preferred when possible. Water remains critical in all conditions. Without enough water, digestion slows and strength fades. Many soldiers remember thirst as clearly as hunger. Throughout the war, food remains closely tied to movement. When armies advance, they eat what they carry. When they pause, kitchens catch up. When they retreat, meals become uncertain. Every change in position brings a change in diet. This makes food part of strategy as well as survival. At the end of long days, soldiers still gather when possible to eat whatever they have. They open tins, boil water, and divide portions. These meals are not celebrations, but they create moments of rest inside a life shaped by danger. Eating becomes one of the few regular acts that continues from day to day. As the war moves into its later years, food becomes more closely linked to the success or failure of military campaigns. Armies that can feed their soldiers well are able to move farther and fight longer, while armies with weak supply systems struggle even when they have weapons and men. By this time, military planners understand that food is as important as fuel and ammunition. Large systems are built to transport meals across oceans and through ruined landscapes. Trains, trucks, and ships carry not only soldiers but millions of tons of flour, meat, sugar, and preserved vegetables. Behind every advancing army is a long chain of farms, factories, and kitchens working to keep soldiers fed. In Europe, Allied soldiers often depend on mobile field kitchens when the front lines pause. These kitchens cook soup, stew, or porridge in large metal pots and deliver it forward in insulated containers. The meals are made from dried vegetables, canned meat, and flour. When bread is available, it is baked near the front lines. Fresh bread becomes rare but highly valued. When supply routes are damaged, soldiers return to packaged rations. These rations are designed to last for long periods and survive rough handling. They include meat, biscuits, powdered soup, jam, sugar, and sometimes cheese. The goal is to provide enough energy for long marches and physical labor, rather than to provide variety. In Germany, food shortages become more serious as bombing increases and farming areas are lost. Soldiers receive smaller portions and rely more on preserved foods. Bread becomes darker and heavier as different grains are mixed together. Meat becomes less frequent. Potatoes and cabbage form a large part of meals when available. Field kitchens still operate, but they use simpler ingredients and smaller quantities. Hunger becomes more common, especially in the final years of the war. In the Soviet Union, food supply is uneven and often poor, especially during long battles and harsh winters. Soldiers eat black bread, porridge made from grains, cabbage soup, and small amounts of meat when it can be provided. When supply lines break, soldiers depend on whatever can be found locally. This includes potatoes, vegetables, and sometimes animals taken from farms. Warm soup remains one of the most important parts of a meal because it provides heat as well as nutrition. In the Pacific War, American forces depend heavily on shipments of canned and dried food from across the ocean. Meals include canned meat, dried eggs, powdered milk, crackers, and chocolate. Fresh food is rare except when bases are established for long periods. Japanese soldiers rely heavily on rice, dried fish, and preserved vegetables. When supply ships are destroyed, food shortages become severe. Soldiers are forced to survive on reduced rations and local food sources such as roots, fruit, and captured supplies. In North Africa and the Middle East, heat shapes every part of food supply. Fresh food spoils quickly, so canned and dried food dominates. Soldiers eat hard biscuits, tinned meat, and powdered drinks. Water is carefully rationed and transported in large containers. Meals are often eaten at night to avoid the heat of the day. Salt becomes important because it replaces what is lost through sweat. On naval ships, food storage and planning are highly organized. Ships leave port with large amounts of canned meat, dried vegetables, flour, and preserved fruit. Fresh food is eaten first. As time passes, meals become more repetitive. Sailors eat bread and vegetables early in a voyage and then move on to canned goods. Space limits cooking, so meals are simple and repeated. Submarine crews rely almost entirely on preserved food because fresh supplies cannot be replaced while underwater. Food also affects how soldiers feel about the war. When meals are regular and filling, morale improves. When food is missing or poor in quality, frustration grows. Soldiers complain about rations, but they also depend on them completely. Letters home often mention food because it is one of the few daily experiences shared by everyone in uniform. A hot meal becomes a sign of safety. A missed meal becomes a sign of danger. Soldiers also change their food through cooking and trade. They mix rations together, fry canned meat when possible, and add local vegetables when found. They trade with civilians when allowed. Bread, fruit, and eggs are sometimes purchased or exchanged for cigarettes or chocolate. These exchanges allow soldiers to eat something different from standard rations and connect them briefly to civilian life. In many places, food becomes a reason to stop and rest. After long marches or fighting, soldiers eat before sleeping. These meals are not large, but they help restore strength. Eating together creates a short break from stress. Even in ruined cities or muddy fields, the act of sharing food creates a moment of order in a world shaped by movement and violence. Throughout the war, food remains tied to geography, transport, and time. A soldier's diet changes depending on where he is, how far he has traveled, and how strong supply lines are. What remains constant is the need to eat enough to keep moving. The story of what soldiers ate is not separate from the story of the war itself. It is part of how armies advanced, how they held ground, and how they endured long periods of hardship. As the war continues and stretches into more distant and difficult regions, food supply becomes even more dependent on planning and organization rather than on local resources. By this stage, armies understand that feeding soldiers is a continuous operation that must run without pause. Warehouses are built near ports and rail lines. Large stocks of flour, canned meat, sugar, and dried vegetables are stored and moved forward as armies advance. Behind every frontline unit is a long chain of workers who harvest crops, pack food, load trucks, and guard supply routes. When this system works, soldiers eat regularly. When it breaks, hunger follows quickly. In Western Europe, after the Allied landings, food distribution improves gradually as ports are captured and roads are repaired. Soldiers receive hot meals more often from field kitchens. These kitchens use dried vegetables, canned meat, and flour to prepare thick soups, stews, and sometimes bread. Fresh vegetables and meat become more available as nearby farms are brought back into use. Milk and eggs appear occasionally, especially for units stationed in villages rather than on the front line. Even small additions like onions or fresh bread change how meals feel and break the monotony of preserved food. In occupied and heavily damaged areas, food remains scarce for both soldiers and civilians. Soldiers sometimes receive better rations than the local population, which creates tension. Armies try to limit taking food from civilians, but shortages lead to local buying, trading, and in some cases forced collection. This causes diets to mix. Soldiers eat local bread, soup, and vegetables when available. Civilians see foreign rations such as canned meat and powdered milk. War reshapes food habits on both sides of the line. In Eastern Europe, long distances and poor roads make food transport difficult. Soviet soldiers often depend on simple meals such as porridge made from grains, black bread, and cabbage soup. When supply trains fail to arrive, units turn to local farms and forests. Potatoes, beets, and wild plants are gathered. Meat is rare and usually comes from animals taken locally. During winter, food becomes heavier in grains and fats when available, because these provide more energy in cold conditions. In Italy and southern Europe, soldiers encounter different foods based on climate and farming. Olive oil, bread, pasta, and vegetables appear in local meals. Allied soldiers sometimes eat pasta, tomatoes, and cheese when supply lines and local markets allow. These foods are mixed with standard rations such as canned meat and biscuits. Meals become a blend of military issue and local cooking. In the Pacific Islands, food remains limited by transport and climate. American forces rely on canned meat, dried vegetables, powdered eggs, and rice. Fresh meat is rare unless animals are brought in by ship. Japanese forces rely heavily on rice, dried fish, and preserved vegetables. When supply ships are lost, both sides face shortages. Soldiers turn to coconuts, fruit, roots, and fish when possible. Cooking is often done over small fires, and meals are eaten quickly to avoid insects and heat. On long campaigns, ration sizes are adjusted based on activity. During heavy fighting, soldiers receive higher calorie rations when supply allows. During periods of rest, portions may be smaller. Commanders understand that hungry soldiers move more slowly and tire more quickly. Food becomes part of planning alongside fuel and ammunition. A unit cannot advance far if it cannot be fed. On the sea, naval food supply remains carefully controlled. Ships carry large stocks of canned meat, dried vegetables, flour, and preserved fruit. Bread and fresh food are used first, then replaced by canned meals. Sailors eat on fixed schedules when possible. Submarines rely on tightly packed supplies, and fresh food disappears early in patrols. As patrols continue, meals become simpler and more repetitive. Food also affects discipline and morale. When meals arrive on time and in good condition, soldiers trust their supply system. When meals are delayed or spoiled, frustration grows. Complaints about food are common in letters and diaries, but food remains one of the strongest links between soldiers and their home life. The taste of bread, soup, or coffee reminds them of normal routines. Throughout the war, cooking methods remain basic. Many meals are boiled or heated in tins. Fires are kept small and hidden when near the front. Utensils are limited, so soldiers eat with knives, spoons, or directly from containers. Helmets and empty tins are sometimes used to heat food. These methods show how eating adapts to movement and danger. As the war approaches its later stages, food supply improves for some armies and worsens for others. Allied forces benefit from strong industrial production and shipping. German and Japanese forces face increasing shortages as blockades and bombing reduce access to farms and factories. This difference appears directly on the plate. Meals become larger and more varied for some soldiers, and smaller and more limited for others. Food remains part of daily routine until the end of the war. Whether eaten in a trench, a ruined house, a ship's deck, or a jungle camp, meals continue to mark the passing of time. They provide energy, structure, and brief moments of rest inside a life shaped by movement and danger. The story of what soldiers eat during the war is therefore not separate from the story of how they fight and how they survive. As the war enters its final years, food supply becomes one of the clearest signs of which nations are winning and which are struggling. Armies with strong factories, farms, and shipping routes are able to feed their soldiers more regularly, while those cut off from resources face growing shortages. By this time, food is no longer just a daily concern, but a strategic issue. Governments plan harvests around military needs. Crops are directed toward armies first, and civilians accept rationing so soldiers can be fed. Wheat, sugar, meat, and fats are carefully counted and assigned. Feeding soldiers becomes part of national planning, not just military routine. In Western Europe, as Allied forces push forward, food distribution improves in many areas. Supply trucks follow behind advancing troops carrying flour, canned meat, vegetables, and bread. Field kitchens work continuously, preparing large quantities of soup and stew. These meals are often based on dried vegetables, meat preserved in tins and thickened with flour or grains. Fresh food appears more often as ports and railways are repaired. Soldiers stationed in towns and villages sometimes receive milk, eggs, and fresh bread. These foods change the feeling of daily meals and reduce the dependence on packaged rations. In contrast, German soldiers face increasing difficulty in obtaining food as bombing destroys transport networks and farming areas are lost. Bread is made with mixed grains and fillers. Meat becomes rare. Potatoes, cabbage, and turnips become more important. Field kitchens still operate, but portions grow smaller and ingredients simpler. Soldiers rely more on hard bread, soup powders, and preserved foods. Hunger becomes a frequent experience, especially for units cut off from regular supply lines. In Eastern Europe, Soviet soldiers continue to depend heavily on simple meals. Black bread, porridge made from barley or oats, and cabbage soup remain central to their diet. When supply trains are delayed or destroyed, soldiers depend on what can be found locally. This includes potatoes, carrots, beets, and sometimes livestock taken from farms. During winter campaigns, fat and grain become especially important because they provide energy for movement in cold conditions. Warm soup remains one of the most valued parts of any meal because it warms the body and fills the stomach at the same time. In Italy and parts of southern Europe, soldiers encounter foods shaped by local farming. Bread, pasta, olive oil, tomatoes, and vegetables become part of meals when available. Allied soldiers mix these foods with their standard rations. Pasta is cooked using canned meat and vegetables. Bread is eaten with jam or margarine from military supplies. These combinations reflect how military food and local food blend during long occupations. In the Pacific War, food remains difficult to supply because of distance and climate. American forces depend on large shipments of canned meat, dried vegetables, powdered eggs, and rice. Fresh food is limited to bases that can receive regular ships. Japanese forces rely heavily on rice and preserved fish. As supply routes are cut, food shortages become severe. Soldiers turn to local sources such as coconuts, bananas, roots, and fish. Cooking is simple and often done over small fires. Meals are eaten quickly because of insects, heat, and danger. On long sea voyages, naval crews continue to rely on carefully planned stores. Ships leave port with large amounts of canned food, dried vegetables, flour, and preserved fruit. Fresh bread, meat, and vegetables are eaten first. Over time, meals become more repetitive and depend almost entirely on preserved foods. Submarines carry limited fresh supplies that disappear early in patrols. After that, crews rely on canned meat, dried bread, and powdered drinks. Storage space limits variety, so menus become simple and repeated. Food also plays a role in discipline and organization. Meals are served at set times when possible. This structure gives soldiers a sense of routine even when everything else changes. Commanders understand that tired and hungry soldiers lose strength and focus. Effort is made to keep food moving forward even under difficult conditions. When meals are missed, it affects morale and efficiency. Complaints about food appear in letters and diaries, but the presence of any food at all often brings relief. Soldiers continue to adapt their food to their situation. They combine rations in different ways, heat canned food when possible, and add local ingredients when found. They trade with civilians or other units. Coffee, sugar, and chocolate are especially valuable because they can be eaten quickly and give a feeling of energy. These small changes make repeated meals easier to endure. By the final stages of the war, the difference in food supply between opposing sides becomes clear. Allied soldiers receive more regular and varied meals as supply lines grow stronger. German and Japanese soldiers face greater shortages as resources disappear. This difference affects strength, movement, and endurance. Food becomes a quiet measure of military power. Throughout the war, meals remain part of daily life for every soldier, no matter where he is stationed. Whether eating soup in a ruined house, canned meat in a jungle camp, or bread on a ship's deck, soldiers continue to rely on food as the base of their strength. The story of what they eat shows how war shapes everyday life, and how survival depends not only on weapons and orders, but on the ability to keep bodies moving and minds steady through long periods of hardship. As the war moves closer to its end, food supply becomes more uneven than ever before, and this unevenness shapes the daily experience of soldiers in different armies. For those with strong industrial support and secure transport routes, meals become more regular and more predictable. For those cut off by enemy action, food becomes a constant concern. Soldiers begin to measure time not only by days and battles, but by when the next meal will arrive. Hunger and eating become part of the rhythm of war. In areas recently captured by advancing armies, soldiers often depend on a mix of military rations and whatever local food can be found. Fields that have survived fighting may still produce grain or vegetables. Livestock left behind by civilians sometimes becomes a source of meat. Military kitchens adapt by using local ingredients alongside preserved supplies. Bread made from local flour is combined with canned meat. Vegetables from nearby farms are added to soup. These meals are simple but more varied than packaged rations alone. They reflect how military food changes when armies move through farming regions. In Germany during the final stages of the war, shortages become severe. Bombing disrupts transport and reduces access to farmland. Soldiers receive smaller portions and less variety. Bread is mixed with substitutes such as potatoes or other grains. Meat is rare. Soup becomes thinner. Hunger weakens strength and morale. Soldiers spend more time thinking about food and less about anything else. Letters home mention hunger as often as fighting. Food becomes a sign of how the war is being lost. In the Soviet Union, food remains basic but steady where supply lines are intact. Black bread, porridge, and cabbage soup continue to form the main diet. When fighting moves into German territory, Soviet soldiers sometimes find better supplies in captured stores. This leads to temporary improvement in meals. However, long marches and damaged roads still limit regular delivery. Soldiers continue to rely on simple, filling foods that can be cooked in large pots and shared easily. In Western Europe, Allied soldiers benefit from growing control of ports and railways. As transport improves, fresh food becomes more common. Milk, bread, and vegetables appear more often in meals. Field kitchens expand their menus slightly, adding thicker stews and baked goods when possible. While preserved food remains important, fresh items reduce fatigue from repetition. Soldiers notice the difference in both taste and energy. In the Pacific War, food supply remains difficult until the end. Islands depend entirely on ships for delivery. When ships are delayed or sunk, shortages appear quickly. American forces continue to rely on canned meat, dried vegetables, and powdered products. Japanese forces face extreme shortages as supply routes are cut. Rice becomes scarce. Soldiers depend more on roots, fruit, and captured food. Hunger becomes a major problem, affecting strength and movement. On ships, food remains carefully controlled until the war ends. Sailors continue to eat from stored supplies, with fresh food used first and preserved food later. On long voyages, bread becomes hard, vegetables disappear, and meals become simple combinations of canned meat and dried goods. Cooking is limited by space and fuel. Meals are eaten quickly and often on fixed schedules when conditions allow. Food also remains important for maintaining routine. Even when fighting is heavy, units try to keep regular meal times when possible. This helps maintain order and discipline. Eating becomes one of the few moments when soldiers stop moving and sit together. These pauses allow rest and create a sense of shared experience. The meal itself becomes a marker of time passing. Soldiers continue to adjust their meals to circumstances. They heat food when fires can be hidden. They mix ingredients to change flavor. They trade among themselves. Coffee, sugar, and chocolate remain valued items because they provide energy and comfort. Even small additions to a meal make long days easier to endure. By the final months of the war, the contrast between well-supplied and poorly supplied armies becomes clear. Allied soldiers eat more regularly and with more variety. German and Japanese soldiers face serious shortages. This difference affects how long units can fight and how far they can move. Food becomes an indicator of strength behind the lines. When fighting ends, food remains central to recovery. Soldiers returning home notice the difference between wartime meals and civilian food. For many, the memory of rations remains strong. The taste of canned meat, hard biscuits, and thin soup becomes part of how they remember the war. These foods are linked not to comfort, but to endurance. Throughout the conflict, what soldiers eat reflects the state of their armies and their countries. Food moves with troops, changes with geography, and weakens or strengthens with supply. It shapes daily life as much as orders and weapons. The story of wartime meals shows how survival depends not only on strategy and technology, but on the simple ability to provide enough food to keep millions of people moving through years of struggle. As the war finally moves toward its conclusion, food remains one of the clearest reflections of how each army has endured the long years of conflict. By this stage, Millions of soldiers have lived for years on military rations, and their bodies and habits have adapted to these limited diets. Meals are no longer something to look forward to, but something expected, planned, and counted. Soldiers know what will likely be inside a ration before they open it. The contents may change slightly from place to place, but the idea remains the same. Food must be portable, durable, and able to sustain a fighting body for another day. In Western Europe, as Allied armies advance deeper into Germany, supply lines grow stronger rather than weaker. Large ports and railway systems are brought back into use. Warehouses are filled with flour, meat, sugar, and canned vegetables. Field kitchens become more active again, producing hot meals more often. Soldiers eat thick stews made from dried vegetables and canned meat, sometimes with fresh bread. In towns and villages, local food reappears slowly. Milk, eggs, and vegetables become available when farms recover. These changes make meals feel closer to civilian life, even though the war has not yet ended. In Germany, the opposite pattern continues. Food shortages grow worse as transport systems collapse. Soldiers receive smaller rations and fewer fresh items. Bread is made with mixed grains and substitutes. Meat is limited and often replaced with soup made from vegetables and grains. Hunger becomes more common, especially for units cut off from regular deliveries. Soldiers rely heavily on soup and bread because these can be made from whatever ingredients remain. This diet reflects the shrinking resources of the country and the damage done to its farming and transport networks. In the Soviet Union, food remains based on simple and filling meals. Black bread, porridge, and cabbage soup continue to form the main diet. As the Red Army moves westward, captured supplies improve conditions slightly for some units. German food stores provide flour, sugar, and preserved goods. However, long distances and destroyed railways still limit regular supply. Soldiers often depend on what can be cooked in large quantities and shared easily. Soup and porridge remain central because they can feed many people at once with limited ingredients. In Southern Europe, food reflects local agriculture. Soldiers eat bread, pasta, olive oil, vegetables, and beans when these can be found. These foods are mixed with standard military rations. Pasta is combined with canned meat. Bread is eaten with jam or margarine from ration packs. These meals show how military and civilian food traditions blend during occupation and advance. Diets change not because of choice, but because of location. In the Pacific War, conditions remain harsh until the very end. Islands depend entirely on ships for food. When supply routes are interrupted, shortages appear quickly. American forces continue to rely on canned meat, dried vegetables, and powdered products. Japanese forces face extreme scarcity as ships are sunk and air routes fail. Rice becomes limited. Soldiers depend on roots, fruit, and captured food when possible. Cooking remains simple, often done over small fires. Meals are eaten quickly because of insects, heat, and danger. On naval vessels, food planning remains strict until the war's end. Ships leave port with large supplies of preserved food. Fresh food is eaten early in voyages. Later meals rely on canned meat, dried bread, and preserved vegetables. Submarines depend almost entirely on these foods after their fresh supplies run out. Storage space and fuel limits keep cooking simple. Meals are served on fixed schedules when conditions allow. Food also shapes how soldiers experience the end of the war. As fighting slows, some units receive better meals to restore strength. Others remain on reduced rations until transport systems recover. Soldiers notice the difference immediately. Better meals signal safety and stability. Poor meals suggest continued hardship. Food becomes one of the first signs that life is changing again. After the war, many soldiers remember their meals as clearly as their battles. The taste of canned meat, hard biscuits, thin soup, and strong coffee becomes part of how they recall their time in uniform. These foods represent endurance rather than pleasure. They are linked to long marches, cold nights, and shared moments of rest. Wartime meals become symbols of survival rather than of comfort. Across all fronts, what soldiers eat during the Second World War shows how armies depend on systems far beyond the battlefield. Farms, factories, ships, and railways all shape what appears on a soldier's plate. Food reflects geography, industry, and supply lines as much as military planning. A soldier's daily diet becomes a quiet record of how the war is being fought and sustained. Throughout the conflict, meals remain part of the rhythm of military life. Whether eaten in a trench, a ruined house, a jungle camp, or on a ship's deck, food continues to mark the passing of time. It provides strength for movement, structure for the day, and moments of rest in a life shaped by uncertainty. The history of what soldiers eat during the war is therefore not separate from the history of the war itself. It shows how survival depends not only on weapons and strategy, but on the steady supply of simple meals that allow millions of people to continue moving through years of struggle. As the war reaches its final phase, food supply begins to reflect the collapse or recovery of entire nations. Armies that still control factories, farms, and transport routes are able to feed their soldiers more consistently, while those losing territory and resources face increasing hunger. By this time, the connection between food and military strength is clear. Units that receive regular meals can move, fight, and hold positions longer than those that cannot. Food becomes a practical measure of how well a war effort is functioning behind the front lines. In Western Europe, Allied forces benefit from expanding control of ports and railroads. Large shipments of flour, meat, sugar, and preserved vegetables arrive from overseas. Field kitchens prepare meals in greater quantities, and hot food becomes more common. Soldiers receive thicker stews, bread, and sometimes fresh vegetables or meat. These improvements reduce dependence on packaged rations alone. Meals still rely heavily on preserved ingredients, but they are cooked in more organized ways. Eating becomes less hurried when fighting slows, and soldiers are able to sit and eat instead of swallowing food while moving. In Germany, the opposite trend continues. Bombing damages transport systems and limits the movement of food from farms to soldiers. Rations shrink further. Bread becomes darker and heavier as more substitutes are mixed into flour. Meat is scarce and often replaced by vegetable soups or grain-based meals. Soldiers spend more time searching for additional food. They collect vegetables from abandoned fields and take supplies from empty buildings. Hunger becomes a daily concern rather than an occasional one. Meals lose variety and become focused on basic survival. In the Soviet Union, food supply improves slightly as captured territories provide new resources. German food stores, farms, and warehouses offer additional supplies. This leads to some improvement in portions and variety for certain units. However, long distances and destroyed railways continue to limit regular delivery. Black bread, porridge, and cabbage soup remain central. These foods are easy to cook in large quantities and can be shared among many soldiers. Warm meals remain especially important during cold weather. because they support physical effort and prevent exhaustion. In Southern and Central Europe, soldiers continue to eat a mix of military rations and local food. Bread, pasta, beans, and vegetables appear when farming recovers. Olive oil and cheese are sometimes added to meals. These foods are combined with canned meat and dried goods from military supplies. This blending of diets shows how food adapts to the land where soldiers are stationed. Military kitchens change recipes based on what can be found nearby. In the Pacific region, food shortages remain severe for some forces. Japanese troops suffer increasing hunger as shipping routes are cut and islands become isolated. Rice supplies diminish, and soldiers rely on roots, fruit, and captured food. American troops maintain better supply through naval transport, but still depend mainly on canned and dried food. Fresh food remains limited to areas with regular deliveries. Meals continue to be shaped by climate, with heat and insects affecting storage and preparation. On naval ships, food remains carefully rationed until the war ends. Crews rely on stored supplies that must last long journeys. Fresh bread and vegetables disappear early in voyages. Canned meat, dried bread, and preserved vegetables form most meals later on. Submarines face even stricter limits, relying almost entirely on preserved food after fresh supplies are used. Space and fuel restrictions keep cooking simple and repetitive. Food also influences behavior and discipline. Soldiers become careful with portions when they know supplies are uncertain. Sharing becomes common within units. Commanders adjust ration sizes based on activity and availability. When food arrives on time, order is easier to maintain. When food is delayed, frustration spreads. Letters and diaries often mention meals because they are one of the few consistent daily experiences shared by all soldiers. As fighting slows and surrender approaches in some regions, food begins to signal change. Better meals suggest stability and approaching peace. Poor meals suggest continued struggle. Soldiers notice these signs immediately. The return of bread, fresh vegetables, and regular portions marks a shift from survival toward recovery. When the war finally ends, soldiers return home with memories shaped not only by battles but by years of eating the same preserved foods. The taste of canned meat, hard biscuits, soup made from powder, and strong coffee becomes linked to their time in uniform. These foods are remembered as tools of endurance rather than pleasure. They represent long marches, cold nights, and shared meals in difficult places. Across all fronts, the story of what soldiers eat shows how war reshapes daily life. Food moves with armies, changes with geography, and weakens or strengthens with supply lines. It reflects the condition of farms, factories, and transport systems as much as it reflects military planning. A soldier's plate becomes a record of how well his country can support him far from home. By the end of the conflict, food has played a quiet but constant role in keeping armies moving through years of hardship. It has shaped routines, influenced morale, and marked the passage of time. The history of wartime meals reveals that survival in the Second World War depended not only on weapons and strategy, but on the steady delivery of simple foods that allowed millions of people to endure long campaigns and return home alive. As the war comes to its final conclusion, the long story of military food supply begins to settle into memory. By this time, millions of soldiers have spent years eating from tins, packets, and field kitchens. Their bodies have adapted to routine meals built around preservation rather than freshness. Food has become something expected rather than enjoyed, something counted rather than chosen. What soldiers eat now reflects not only where they are fighting, but how long the war has lasted and how deeply it has changed daily life. In Western Europe, as fighting ends and cities are liberated, food distribution begins to shift from emergency supply to recovery. Allied soldiers still rely on field kitchens and ration packs, but local farms slowly return to production. Bread becomes more common. Vegetables appear in meals more often. Milk and eggs are sometimes added when transport allows. These foods do not replace military rations immediately, but they soften them. Thick stews made from canned meat and dried vegetables are mixed with fresh ingredients when possible. Meals begin to resemble civilian food again, even while uniforms are still worn. In Germany and areas heavily damaged by bombing, food remains scarce even after fighting stops. Soldiers and civilians alike face shortages. Rations stay small. Soup and bread remain the main meals. Potatoes and cabbage continue to replace meat. The destruction of transport systems means food moves slowly and unevenly. Soldiers stationed in these areas often share similar diets with civilians, depending on relief shipments and local harvests. Military meals and civilian meals become difficult to separate, as both depend on the same damaged supply networks. In Eastern Europe, the situation is mixed. Some regions benefit from captured supplies and reopened farms, while others remain isolated by destroyed railways and roads. Soviet soldiers continue to eat simple meals based on grains and vegetables. Black bread, porridge, and soup remain central. As armies settle into occupation roles, meals become more regular, but not more varied. Food continues to be focused on quantity rather than taste. In Italy and other southern regions, soldiers encounter recovering farms that provide bread, vegetables, and olive oil. Pasta and beans become part of daily meals when available. These foods are still combined with preserved military supplies, such as canned meat and dried goods. The blending of military and local food traditions continues, showing how diet follows geography even in the aftermath of war. In the Pacific, food supply improves slowly after fighting ends. Islands that were once isolated begin to receive regular shipments again. American forces still rely on canned and dried foods, but fresh meat and vegetables appear when ports reopen. Japanese soldiers returning home face shortages caused by damaged agriculture and transport. Rice remains the main food, but portions are small. Recovery is slow and uneven. On naval ships, food remains controlled until crews return to port. Fresh supplies replace preserved food only after long patrols end. Sailors continue to eat simple meals based on stored ingredients until resupply becomes steady. Submarine crews, in particular, experience the change from preserved food to fresh food as a sign that their long journeys are finally over. Food also plays a role in the transition from war to peace. Soldiers returning home notice the difference immediately. Civilian meals feel rich and varied compared to rations. Fresh bread, meat, and vegetables remind them of life before the war. Many soldiers continue to eat quickly and simply out of habit. Years of eating under pressure shape how they approach food even in safe conditions. The memory of wartime meals stays strong. Canned meat, hard biscuits, powdered soup, and strong coffee become symbols of endurance. These foods are remembered not for their flavor, but for their presence during long marches, cold nights, and uncertain days. Shared meals in difficult places become part of personal and national memory. Across all theaters of war, what soldiers eat reflects the condition of their countries. Strong supply systems produce regular meals. Broken systems produce hunger. Farms, factories, ships, and railroads all leave their mark on the contents of a soldier's bowl. Food becomes a quiet record of industrial strength and logistical success. By the end of the Second World War, military food supply is proven to be as important as weapons and strategy. Feeding millions of soldiers across continents requires organization on a massive scale. The daily act of eating becomes part of how armies function and how wars are sustained. Without food, movement stops. Without movement, fighting ends. The history of what soldiers eat during the war shows how deeply conflict enters ordinary life. Meals are shaped by distance, climate, transport, and time. They change as armies move and as nations rise or fall. Through all of this, food remains constant in one way. It is necessary every day in every place for every soldier. In the end, the story of wartime meals is a story of survival. It is about how millions of people continue to live, march, and endure through years of hardship. It shows that behind every battle and every campaign lies a simpler struggle, repeated daily, to provide enough food to keep bodies strong and lives moving forward. As the long war finally settles into its closing stage and its immediate aftermath, food continues to shape how soldiers experience both victory and return. For many, the end of fighting does not immediately bring abundance. Transport systems are damaged, farms have been burned or neglected, and factories must shift from weapons back to civilian needs. Soldiers still rely on organized supply systems for their meals, and these systems now focus on stability rather than speed. Rations become more regular in some places, but variety remains limited. Bread, soup, and preserved foods continue to dominate daily meals while agriculture and trade slowly recover. In Western Europe, occupation forces depend on a mix of military rations and local production. Field kitchens remain active, preparing stews from dried vegetables and canned meat, but fresh bread and vegetables become more common as farms resume work. Soldiers stationed in towns often receive milk, eggs, and local produce when supply allows. These foods change the character of meals and signal a slow return to civilian patterns of eating. Even so, preserved food remains central because it can be moved easily and stored safely in damaged cities. In Germany, food scarcity remains severe. Soldiers and civilians share similar diets based on bread, potatoes, and soup. Meat is rare and often replaced with vegetable or grain-based dishes. Ration cards control distribution, and meals are planned carefully to stretch limited supplies. Military units depend on centralized kitchens and relief shipments. Hunger and thin portions remain part of daily life long after fighting has ended. This shows how war affects food systems long after weapons fall silent. In Eastern Europe, conditions vary widely. Some regions regain access to farmland quickly, while others remain isolated by ruined railways and bridges. Soviet soldiers continue to eat simple meals built around grains and vegetables. Black bread, porridge, and cabbage soup remain common. In areas where captured German supplies exist, meals improve slightly. Still, the emphasis remains on quantity and warmth rather than taste or variety. Food remains focused on sustaining work and movement rather than comfort. In Italy and parts of southern Europe, agriculture recovers more quickly in some areas. Bread, pasta, beans, and olive oil return to local diets. Soldiers stationed there eat meals that blend military rations with regional food. Canned meat is mixed with pasta and vegetables. Bread is eaten with jam or margarine from ration packs. These combinations show how wartime diets slowly merge back into civilian food traditions. In the Pacific region, recovery is slower. Islands that were once isolated begin to receive regular shipments again, but infrastructure remains damaged. American forces still depend on canned and dried foods for many months. Fresh meat and vegetables appear only when ports and farms are restored. Japanese soldiers returning home face shortages due to damaged agriculture and limited transport. Rice remains central, but portions are small. Relief supplies and gradual rebuilding determine what appears on the table. Naval forces experience similar transitions. Ships returning to port replace preserved food with fresh supplies. Sailors notice the difference immediately. Meals with fresh bread, fruit, and vegetables feel unfamiliar after months of canned and dried food. Submarine crews who relied heavily on preserved meals experience the return to fresh food as a clear sign that long patrols and constant danger have ended. Food also shapes how soldiers adjust to civilian life. Many continue to eat quickly and simply, habits formed by years of military routine. Large meals feel strange at first. Some soldiers save food even when it is available, reflecting long periods of uncertainty. The taste of certain preserved foods remains tied to memories of marches, camps, and long nights. Wartime meals become part of personal history, remembered alongside places and events. Across all regions, the way food changes after the war reflects the condition of each country. Areas with strong transport and farming recover faster. Areas with heavy destruction remain dependent on rations and aid. Farms, factories, and railroads determine how quickly soldiers and civilians can return to normal diets. Food becomes a measure of recovery as well as survival. The long story of what soldiers ate during the Second World War shows how deeply conflict shapes everyday life. Diets are formed by geography, supply routes, and industrial capacity. They change with movement and with the rise and fall of nations. From canned meat and hard biscuits to soup and bread, each meal reflects the system that produced it. In the end, wartime food is remembered not for its flavor but for its role in endurance. It supported long marches, cold nights, and constant movement. It provided structure in days shaped by uncertainty. The history of military meals reveals that behind every campaign and every advance lies the same basic need, repeated every day, to provide enough food to keep millions of people alive and moving through years of war. As the world moves fully out of wartime conditions and into the long process of rebuilding, the experience of military food does not disappear from memory or from daily systems of supply. Many armies continue to use ration-based meals for months and even years after the fighting ends because transport networks are still damaged and farms are only slowly returning to full production. Soldiers stationed in occupied or recovering regions eat meals that look very similar to wartime rations. Canned meat, dried vegetables, soup powders, bread, and simple grains remain the foundation of daily food. These meals are no longer shaped by active combat, but by the slow return of agriculture and trade. Food supply becomes part of stabilization rather than movement, designed to keep large numbers of troops fed in places where civilian food systems are still weak. In Western Europe, the gradual reopening of ports and rail lines allows food to move more freely. Allied soldiers receive steadier meals, and local markets begin to operate again. Bread becomes more widely available, Potatoes, onions, and cabbage appear more often. Milk and eggs return in some regions where farms recover quickly. Military kitchens adapt by using these fresh ingredients alongside preserved supplies. Soup becomes thicker and more varied. Stews include vegetables instead of only dried powders. These changes mark a slow shift from emergency feeding to routine nourishment. In Germany and other heavily damaged areas, food shortages remain severe for a long time. Soldiers and civilians depend on ration systems that limit portions of bread, fats, and meat. Meals are built around soup, potatoes, and grain products. Canned food from military stores becomes an important source of protein. The destruction of farms, railways, and storage facilities keeps diets simple and repetitive. Military units often eat the same food as civilians, showing how closely food supply reflects national recovery. In Eastern Europe, conditions vary from region to region. Some areas regain farming capacity quickly, while others remain isolated by destroyed infrastructure. Soviet forces continue to rely on meals based on porridge, bread, and vegetables. Meat appears only when available. Soup remains the central dish because it can be prepared in large quantities and stretched with grains and roots. This pattern continues the wartime emphasis on filling and warm food rather than varied or rich meals. In Southern Europe, food traditions begin to reappear more clearly as agriculture recovers. Soldiers eat meals that include pasta, bread, beans, and olive oil when available. These foods are still mixed with military rations, such as canned meat and dried vegetables. The result is a blended diet that reflects both wartime supply systems and regional farming. Meals slowly return to local styles, but portion sizes remain controlled by ration systems. In the Pacific region, the return to regular food supply takes longer. Many islands remain dependent on imported food for months after the war. American forces still rely heavily on canned and dried goods. Fresh meat and vegetables appear only when ports are repaired and farms are restarted. Japanese soldiers returning home face shortages due to damaged agriculture and transport networks. Rice remains the central food, but portions are limited. Relief shipments and rebuilding efforts determine how quickly diets improve. Naval forces experience a similar transition. Ships returning to regular routes replace preserved food with fresh supplies when possible. Crews notice the change in taste and variety. Bread, fruit, and vegetables replace canned meals. For many sailors, this shift marks the end of long periods of isolation and stored food. Submarine crews, who relied most heavily on preserved meals, experience fresh food as a clear sign of return to ordinary life. Food also shapes how soldiers adjust psychologically to peace. Many continue to eat quickly and without waste, habits learned during years of uncertainty. Some save food even when it is plentiful. The taste of certain preserved items remains strongly linked to wartime experience. Meals become reminders of marches, camps, and long periods away from home. Wartime food becomes part of memory and identity rather than just nourishment. Across all regions, the way soldiers eat after the war reflects the state of recovery. Where farms and transport systems rebuild quickly, diets improve. Where destruction remains heavy, food stays limited. The connection between agriculture, industry, and military supply remains clear. Even in peace, feeding large numbers of soldiers depends on the same systems that supported them during conflict. The long story of what soldiers ate during and after the Second World War shows how deeply war enters everyday life. Diets change with movement, geography, and supply. Meals become simpler, more repetitive, and more controlled as conflict continues. When fighting ends, food slowly becomes varied again, following the return of farming and trade. From tins and packets to bread and vegetables, each stage reflects the condition of the world around it. By looking at what soldiers ate, it becomes clear that survival during the war depended not only on weapons and orders, but on the steady flow of food across continents. Meals supported movement, shaped routines, and marked the passage of time. The history of wartime food reveals how millions of people endured long years of conflict through simple, repeated acts of eating and sharing whatever was available, day after day, until peace finally allowed life to return to ordinary patterns once more. As the post-war world continues to settle into a new order, the systems created to feed soldiers during the conflict do not disappear at once. Military supply networks remain active because large forces are still stationed across Europe and Asia. Food distribution remains organized around ration packs, field kitchens, and centralized storage. These systems, originally designed for movement and battle, are now used for stability and occupation. Meals continue to rely on preserved foods because they can be transported easily and stored safely in areas where farms and markets are still recovering from years of damage. In Western Europe, the gradual return of farming reshapes what soldiers eat. Wheat fields are replanted, dairy production increases, local bakeries begin to operate again. Soldiers stationed in towns receive more bread and vegetables than before, and fresh milk appears more often in meals. Military kitchens adapt by combining preserved meat with fresh produce. Soups become thicker with potatoes, onions, and carrots. Stews include beans and cabbage instead of only dried powders. These meals remain simple, but they reflect a shift away from pure emergency rations toward food that resembles civilian diets. In Germany, food shortages continue longer. Railways and bridges take time to repair. Many farms are damaged or lack workers. Soldiers and civilians depend heavily on ration cards that limit bread, fats, and meat. Meals are built around soup, potatoes, and grain products. Meat is rare and usually replaced by legumes or vegetables. Military kitchens and civilian kitchens often prepare similar food, showing how closely food supply reflects national recovery. Preserved foods from military stores remain important sources of protein and calories. In Eastern Europe, differences between regions remain strong. Some areas regain agricultural output quickly, while others remain isolated by destroyed infrastructure. Soviet soldiers continue to rely on meals based on porridge, black bread, and vegetables. Cabbage soup and grain-based dishes remain central because they can be prepared in large quantities and shared easily. Where captured stores exist, flour and sugar improve meals slightly. However, the emphasis remains on filling food rather than variety or taste. In Southern Europe, warmer climates allow farming to resume more quickly in some places. Soldiers eat meals that include pasta, bread, beans, and olive oil when available. These foods are still mixed with military rations, such as canned meat and dried vegetables. The blending of preserved and fresh ingredients continues, showing how wartime systems slowly merge into peacetime food traditions. Diets become more regional again, shaped by local crops, rather than by distant factories alone. In the Pacific region, food supply remains dependent on shipping long after the fighting ends. Islands rely on imported food while ports and farms are rebuilt. American forces continue to eat canned meat, dried vegetables, and powdered products. Fresh food appears when transport allows, but portions remain controlled. Japanese soldiers returning home face shortages because agriculture and transport networks are damaged. Rice remains the central food, but it is rationed carefully. Relief shipments and rebuilding efforts determine how quickly meals improve. Naval forces also experience gradual change. Ships returning to regular routes replace preserved meals with fresh food when ports reopen fully. Crews notice the difference in both taste and routine. Bread, fruit, and vegetables become regular again. Submarine crews who spent long periods on preserved food experience fresh meals as a return to ordinary life. This change in diet marks the end of constant movement and stored supplies. Food continues to influence how soldiers adjust to peacetime. Many retain habits learned during the war. Meals are eaten quickly. Waste is avoided. Simple foods are preferred. The memory of ration packs and field kitchens remains tied to years of marching and waiting. Preserved foods such as canned meat and dried biscuits remain familiar even when fresh food becomes available. These habits show how long periods of limited diet shape behavior beyond the battlefield. Across all regions, the link between food and recovery becomes clear. Where farms restart and transport improves, diets change first. Where damage remains, food stays limited. Agriculture, industry, and distribution shape what soldiers and civilians eat more than policy alone. Meals become a measure of how far a region has moved from war toward stability. The long history of what soldiers ate during and after the Second World War shows how deeply conflict reshapes everyday needs. Food moves with armies, adapts to geography, and reflects the strength or weakness of supply systems. During the war, meals are designed for movement and survival. After the war, they are shaped by rebuilding and return. From preserved rations to fresh bread and vegetables, each stage of diet reflects a stage of recovery. By following the path of wartime food, it becomes clear that feeding soldiers is never a simple task. It depends on farms, factories, transport, and planning across continents. The meals eaten in camps, trenches, ships, and occupied towns form a quiet record of how the war was sustained and how peace was rebuilt. Through years of conflict and recovery, food remains a constant presence, supporting bodies, shaping routines, and marking the slow transition from battle to ordinary life. As time moves further away from the fighting itself, the systems created to feed soldiers during the war slowly transform into long-term military and civilian food structures. The habits learned in war do not disappear quickly. Large storage depots, transport schedules, and ration planning continue because millions of soldiers remain stationed far from home. Food is still prepared in bulk, moved in convoys, and distributed in controlled portions. Even without daily battles, the scale of feeding armies keeps meals simple, durable, and predictable. In Western Europe, as farms fully return to production, soldiers begin to receive more fresh bread, vegetables, and dairy products. Potatoes, carrots, cabbage, and onions become common ingredients in stews and soups. Military kitchens reduce their reliance on dried powders and use fresh produce when possible. However, canned meat and preserved foods remain part of meals because they are easy to store and transport. This creates a mixed diet where fresh and preserved foods exist side by side. Soldiers eat meals that resemble civilian food more closely, but still follow military routines. In Germany and surrounding regions, shortages continue longer due to destroyed farmland and broken railways. Ration systems remain strict. Soldiers and civilians eat similar meals based on soup, potatoes, bread, and grains. Meat is still limited. Fats such as butter and oil are rationed carefully. These meals reflect a society focused on rebuilding rather than enjoyment. Food becomes something to manage rather than celebrate. Military kitchens often use the same ingredients as civilian kitchens, showing how closely the two food systems remain connected. In Eastern Europe, the pattern of simple and filling meals continues. Grain porridge, bread, and vegetable soup remain the foundation of soldiers' diets. Where transport improves, flour and sugar become more available. Where roads and railways remain damaged, food stays basic and repetitive. The emphasis remains on feeding large numbers of people with limited resources. Meals are designed to be warm, filling, and easy to prepare in large quantities. In Southern Europe, warmer climates allow agriculture to recover more quickly in some areas. Soldiers stationed there eat meals with pasta, beans, bread, olive oil, and vegetables when these are available. These foods blend with preserved military rations, such as canned meat and dried vegetables. This creates meals that reflect both wartime logistics and regional farming traditions. The diet becomes less uniform and more connected to local crops. In the Pacific region, food supply continues to depend on shipping routes. Islands remain reliant on imported food until ports and farms are rebuilt. American forces still receive canned meat, dried vegetables, and powdered products, with fresh food added when transport allows. Japanese soldiers returning home experience continued shortages due to damaged infrastructure. Rice remains central to meals, but portions are controlled. Relief shipments and rebuilding determine how quickly diets improve. On naval vessels, food supply becomes more stable as regular routes resume. Ships carry both preserved and fresh food. Bread, fruit, and vegetables appear more often. Meals remain scheduled and organized, reflecting naval discipline. Submarine crews who once relied almost entirely on preserved food now eat fresh meals again when stationed in ports. This change marks the end of constant isolation and stored supplies. Food also shapes how soldiers experience the transition from war to peace. Many continue to eat quickly and avoid waste. Large meals feel unfamiliar at first. Some soldiers continue to save food out of habit. The memory of ration packs remains strong. Canned meat, biscuits, and powdered soup stay linked to long periods of marching, waiting, and working. These foods become symbols of endurance rather than comfort. Across all regions, the return of fresh food marks progress toward normal life. Where vegetables and bread become common again, stability grows. Where meals remain limited, hardship continues. Food becomes a measure of recovery. Farms, transport systems, and markets determine how quickly diets improve. The long path from wartime rations to peacetime meals shows how deeply conflict reshapes daily life. What soldiers eat reflects the state of the world around them. During the war, food is designed for movement and survival. After the war, it is shaped by rebuilding and return. Each change in diet reflects a change in society itself. Through all stages of the conflict and recovery, food remains a constant need. It supports work, shapes routine, and marks the passage of time. The history of what soldiers eat during and after the Second World War reveals how survival depends not only on strategy and weapons, but on the steady, organized movement of simple meals from farms and factories to the hands of those who serve. As the world continues its slow movement away from total war and into long-term recovery, the experience of military food supply remains deeply connected to the systems built during the conflict. Armies still operate on large scales, and feeding them continues to rely on centralized planning rather than individual choice. Even in peacetime conditions, soldiers eat according to schedules, portion sizes, and delivery systems shaped by wartime needs. Meals remain practical rather than decorative, built around foods that can be moved easily, stored safely, and prepared in bulk. This shows how deeply the war has shaped not only what soldiers eat, but how food itself is organized. In Western Europe, as industries and farms regain strength, soldiers' diets continue to improve slowly. Bread becomes lighter and more refined as wheat supplies grow. Vegetables such as carrots, onions, and cabbage appear regularly in soups and stews. Dairy products return in small amounts, especially for units stationed near farming regions. Meat remains present but is often mixed into large dishes rather than served in large portions on its own. Military kitchens continue to rely on preserved food as a base, adding fresh ingredients when supply allows. This method keeps meals reliable while allowing gradual change in taste and variety. In Germany and neighboring regions, food scarcity remains visible for a longer time. Rationing continues, and meals are built around simple ingredients such as potatoes, bread, and grain-based soups. Meat and fats remain limited, so protein often comes from beans or other plant sources. Soldiers eat food similar to what civilians receive, reflecting the shared condition of recovery. Military kitchens focus on stretching ingredients to feed large numbers. Soups and stews dominate because they allow small amounts of meat or fat to flavor large volumes of food. In Eastern Europe, the pattern of simple meals continues. Grain porridge, black bread, and vegetable soups remain central to soldiers' diets. Where transport improves, flour and sugar become more common, allowing slightly richer meals. However, long distances and damaged railways still limit variety. The focus remains on warmth and fullness rather than taste. These meals reflect the need to support physical work and long duty hours in difficult conditions. In Southern Europe, agricultural recovery allows diets to reconnect more closely with local traditions. Soldiers eat pasta, beans, bread, and vegetables when available. Olive oil appears again in cooking. These foods mix with military rations such as canned meat and dried vegetables. This blending shows how wartime food systems gradually give way to regional patterns. Diets become shaped more by climate and crops and less by distant factories. In the Pacific region, food supply continues to depend on sea transport for a long time. Islands and distant bases remain reliant on imported food. Soldiers eat canned meat, dried vegetables, and powdered products, with fresh food appearing when ports and farms are restored. Japanese soldiers returning home face continued shortages because agriculture and transport networks remain damaged. Rice remains the central food, but portions are small and carefully controlled. Recovery of diet depends on rebuilding fields, mills, and shipping routes. On naval vessels, food systems remain organized and controlled even after combat ends. Ships carry both preserved and fresh food. Bread, fruit, and vegetables appear more often as regular trade routes resume. Meals remain scheduled and repetitive, reflecting naval discipline. Submarine crews, who once relied almost entirely on preserved food, now experience fresh meals again when based in ports. This change marks a shift from isolation and endurance to routine service. Food continues to shape how soldiers think about their service. Many retain habits of eating quickly and avoiding waste. Some continue to save food even when it is available. The memory of ration packs and field kitchens remains strong. Canned meat, hard biscuits, and powdered soup remain connected to long marches and uncertain days. These foods become part of how soldiers remember the war, not as comforts but as necessities that allowed life to continue. Across all regions, the improvement of food supply becomes one of the clearest signs of recovery. Where farms produce more and transport systems function again, meals become larger and more varied. Where destruction remains heavy, food stays limited and repetitive. Diet becomes a measure of stability. The contents of a soldier's bowl show the condition of the land and the strength of the systems that support it. The long path from wartime rations to peacetime meals shows how deeply conflict reshapes everyday needs. During the war, food is designed for movement, storage, and survival. After the war, it slowly returns to variety and local character. Each change in diet reflects a wider change in society, from emergency to rebuilding, from scarcity to slow growth. Through all these stages, one pattern remains constant. Soldiers continue to depend on organized food supply to carry out their duties. Meals mark the passing of days and structure long hours of work and waiting. The history of what soldiers eat during and after the Second World War reveals that behind every campaign and every period of recovery lies the same essential task, repeated daily on a massive scale, to move food from fields and factories into the hands of those who serve. As the long years of war finally settle into history, the story of what soldiers ate comes to its natural close, not with a sudden change, but with a slow return to ordinary life. The systems built to feed millions of people across continents begin to shrink and simplify. Field kitchens are packed away. Ration packs are replaced by market food. Supply routes that once served only armies now carry food for families and towns again. Yet the habits formed during the war remain visible for many years. Soldiers who return home often continue to eat simply and without waste, shaped by long experience of limited portions and uncertain delivery. Across Europe and Asia, farms gradually return to full production. Fields that once lay empty are planted again. Livestock herds grow slowly. Mills begin to grind grain for civilian bread, rather than military rations. As this happens, meals become larger and more varied. Fresh vegetables replace dried ones. Bread becomes softer and lighter. Meat appears more often. These changes mark not only the end of hunger, but the return of choice. Food is no longer counted only in calories and transport weight. It becomes part of culture again. For many former soldiers, the taste of wartime food remains strong in memory. Canned meat, hard biscuits, powdered soup, and bitter coffee stay linked to years of movement and waiting. These foods are remembered not because they were enjoyable, but because they were constant. They supported long marches, cold nights, and uncertain days. Shared meals in ruined buildings, forests, ships, and camps become part of personal history. Food becomes tied to friendship, endurance, and survival. The story of what soldiers ate during the Second World War shows how deeply war reaches into ordinary life. It reveals how farms, factories, railways, and ships shape daily survival. It shows that battles are not fought by weapons alone, but by the steady movement of bread, grain, and preserved meat across oceans and borders. Without food, armies cannot move. Without movement, war cannot continue. By following the path of wartime meals, it becomes clear that survival depended on organization as much as courage. Every bowl of soup, every piece of bread, and every tin of meat reflects a vast system of work behind the front lines. Farmers, factory workers, drivers, and cooks all played a part in keeping soldiers alive. Food became the quiet partner of strategy and command. As this history comes to rest, what remains is a simple truth. In the middle of destruction and change, the need to eat stayed the same. Soldiers still needed warmth, strength, and routine. Meals gave structure to days shaped by uncertainty. They marked time when clocks and calendars lost meaning. They carried people through years of hardship until peace allowed life to become ordinary again. And so, the story of what soldiers ate during the war closes where it began, with the most basic human need. From preserved rations to fresh bread, from thin soup to shared meals, food carried armies through the longest struggle of their lives. It remains a quiet record of endurance written not in documents alone but in memory, habit, and the simple act of eating.